Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 216. This week the questions are taken from Guide 258 on HNLMS De Ruyter and the Anglo-German Dreadnought arms race video, which was obviously published on a Wednesday. So let's begin. Trauco1388 asks, was the change from the 12-inch to the 13.5-inch gun caused by the failure of the latest model of high-velocity 12-inch gun? Certainly that's the more popular narrative that you'll find in a variety of books and websites and everything, but I don't think it's entirely accurate for a few reasons. Firstly, when you look at the actual design documents for the St. Vincent class, which was the first class of British battleship to mount the 12-inch 50, you'll actually find that they were considering both the 12-inch 50 in the Dreadnought layout and a 13.5-inch 50 with an 8-gun layout. Now, granted, the 13.5-inch 50 is not the same gun as the 13.5-inch 45 that would actually be deployed on the Orion class, but it shows that actually before they even put the 12-inch 50 on the first class of battleship it would eventually be equipped on, they were comparing it with the prospect of going with fewer but larger guns. And additional to that, the initial Admiralty calls for design that would lead to the 13.5-inch 45 went out in 1908. Now, why is that important? Well, in 1908, the first of the St. Vincents wasn't even in the water yet. Then you also have the fact that by the time that Orion's design was approved, with the 10 13.5-inch guns, the final ships that the Royal Navy would have with the 12-inch 50s weren't even design approved yet. I mean, they were designing ships quite quickly and constantly, but the very, very start of the Orion design process said we're going to have 13.5-inch guns, and at that point they hadn't finalised the design of Colossus and Hercules, which were the ones which were immediately preceding them, which had the 12.5-inch gun. And the initial scope of Orion's design, which specified 13.5-inch 45 guns, obviously under development initially as a specialist version of 12-inch 50, much the same as the 15-inch would later be under development as a supposed specialist development of the 13.5. That initial scope starts, just about when the St. Vincents are coming into commission. Now, granted, there were tests of the 12-inch 50 before it came into active service on ships that did reflect some of the issues with whipping, not fully burnt propellant, and therefore great inaccuracy. However, I think given the fact that, as I said, the 12-inch 50 was considered for first deployment alongside a theoretical 13.5-inch gun, well, that indicates that the interest in the 13.5-inch weapon as a caliber precedes any success or failure of the 12-inch 50, and then the early decision to arm the Orions when very little operational data, if any, from actively deployed 12-inch 50 guns could be gathered, also indicates to me that they were looking at that as a caliber choice ahead of the failure of the 12-inch 50. Now, perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the failure of the 12-inch 50 galvanized the choice to go with a 13.5-inch 45 caliber weapon, and it precluded the use of the 12-inch 50 on further ships. So there's a certain degree of truth in saying that the 13.5-inch partially owes its existence to the 12-inch 50's failure. However, I don't think that's the full story. I think the Royal Navy was looking to upgrade to a bigger gun caliber for a fair bit of time before you could really say that the 12-inch 50 had proven itself to be the failure that it was upon initial deployment on active role battleships. If there was any deep consideration going further back driving interest in a 13.5-inch, it would have been based off of some very few land-based tests with individual or maybe the occasional twin barrel, which, that's not enough without spectacularly bad results, to write off an entire development. basically most of the data that shows just how bad the 12-inch 50 was, especially when it was initially deployed, comes after it can be categorically proven the Royal Navy is already moving towards 13.5. UNSC Forward On to Dawn asks, I've been listening to Max Hastings' book on the first months of World War I. In his chapter on the naval war, he claims that even if the High Seas Fleet had managed to gain a decisive victory over the Grand Fleet, it is most likely that they wouldn't have knocked Britain out of the war, as the High Seas Fleet didn't have the capabilities to exploit such a victory, such as establishing a blockade of the British Isles, mounting an invasion of Britain, etc., etc. What's your take on his view? I find myself in a degree of disagreement with him, which, to be fair, is not the first time people who read and study naval history found themselves in disagreement with him, but nonetheless. Now, a lot of it depends on exactly how the High Seas Fleet defeats the Ground Fleet. Now, I don't mean in terms of tactics, I mean in terms of how much of both sides' fleets are left standing afterwards. Because a decisive victory over the Grand Fleet could be Grand Fleet cedes the field after losing, let's say, half a dozen battleships, and the Germans lose 2. And it's clear that it's going badly for the Royal Navy, other Royal Navy ships are damaged. Okay, that would be a decisive victory. Excluding losses in cruisers and destroyers and so forth, but assuming that the proportions are similar. Now, if that happens, then yes, at that point, maybe the High Seas Fleet doesn't have the capability to exploit that victory, but that will be because they've knocked the Grand Fleet down to approximate parity, and the Grand Fleet has a lot more ships coming in, and of course the ships coming in, the remaining Queen Elizabeth, the Revengers and so forth, are much more capable and much more powerful than their predecessors, and so the High Seas Fleet has basically bought itself some breathing space, not actual dominance. However, if we're looking at specifically whether or not they have the capacity at all to exploit a victory, we must therefore assume, for the sake of argument, that the victory is decisive enough that it has completely destroyed the Grand Fleet as an instrument of power projection or really significant home defence. Now, in that case, even if you've got a rump of maybe 8 to 10 dreadnoughts, which will obviously then be reinforced, then even that Grand Fleet can't meaningfully challenge the High Seas Fleet, which presumably in this scenario has not suffered significant losses of its own. Now, can the High Seas Fleet support an invasion of Britain? No, it can't. But that's not exactly surprising, considering that, well, the German army is currently fighting this massive war in France and this other massive war in Russia. So where the German army would find enough troops to also, man transports and launch an invasion of the UK is, it's kind of separate to whether or not the High Seas Fleet has the capability of escorting them over and then sustaining the supply runs that would be necessary. However, in terms of knocking Britain out of the war, if we assume the scenario that we just sort of posited, I would argue that potentially the High Seas Fleet does have that capability. Even if most of their battleships have to stay in port as a guard against the rump of the Grand Fleet or against a resurgent Grand Fleet, as we said, as the 15-inch ships come online, well, and HMS Tiger for what that's worth, first scouting group, the Battlecruisers, and various armoured cruisers, well, the few that Germany has, protected cruisers, etc. If the bulk of the Grand Fleet and its escorts have been destroyed, then they can run rampant in the Western Approaches area, basically just sitting off the coast of Britain. Yes, it's not going to be 100% tight blockade, and yes, ships will get through, but any attempt to organise a major convoy escorted by the Grand Fleet will just meet with the High Seas Fleet coming out to challenge it. And that many armed surface raiders, and given the Germans can also then start deploying armed merchant raiders as well, plus U-boats, they would catch enough merchant ships and deter enough merchant ships from making the runs that I think they could disrupt the supply lines enough to make the British consider suing for peace. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be a perfect blockade, because the thing is, yes, you can point to the British blockade, which would be far more thorough, of Germany, and say, Germany was still fighting 4 years later. Yes, but Germany was a land-based power that was a lot more self-sustainable when it comes to major resources than Britain is at that point. And even then, that blockade was tightening the noose on Germany's neck inch by inch. When you look at how close things came in 1917 with, quote-unquote, just the U-boat campaign, if you've got the major disruption of surface raiders nicking everything left, right and centre, and bear in mind that big surface raiders like armoured cruisers and battlecruisers can potentially go quite far afield and disrupt ports and trade routes well beyond the reach of World War I U-boats, yeah, that might force Britain out of the war. John Smith asks, in the climax of the Strike Witches movie, the Japanese, quote-unquote, attach flotation drums to the side of the Yamato so she can sail up the Rhine River and conduct shore bombardment against the aliens invading inland Germany. Is the idea of reducing a warship's draft in this way at all plausible? And if so, could this method have allowed the Japanese Navy to change the course of the war in China if you had waved away the inter-service rivalry with the army? In terms of just attaching flotation drums, no. For a couple of reasons. One, they're insanely non-hydrodynamic, so you would not be moving very fast through them at all before they got ripped off the sides. Second, any significant amount of flotation that was enough to create enough, buoyancy to lift a battleship a meaningful amount out of the water would put so much strain on, because of the force it's generating, on any kind of attachment chains or ropes that they'd probably be ripped off very quickly. And third, just attaching a bunch of flotation stuff loosely, which is what attaching flotation drums would involve, to a ship and then raising it up out of the water would change its stability calculations so much the thing would probably just roll over. However, the idea of attaching something to the side of a vessel to improve its flotation to let it get into shallower drafts of water, that has been done in the form of bulging. Now, bulging obviously was in part done to protect against torpedo attacks, but it did have the other useful effect when properly calculated and, of course, physically attached to the ship's structure of lifting the ship out of the water. Now, sometimes that bulging was introduced as part of a refit to counteract the additional draft that was caused by loading ships up more heavily, and other times when it was taken to extremes, as with the Monitor you can see here, it was mostly for torpedo protection, but also with the monitors to ensure a very shallow draft so they could operate in coastal waters. And then, of course, you have Operation Catherine, which in one or two of its variations involved fitting massive bulges to R-class battleships, in part to defend against torpedoes, but also in part to massively reduce their draft so that they could sail around, again in the coastal waters, in that case off of eastern Denmark and northeastern Germany, without running aground. So yes, in theory it's plausible, but not by attaching a bunch of flotation drums. It would be a dedicated dockyard job to attach massive bulging to the ship, and that also will then be flared to help with the stability issues caused by raising the ship out of the water. Could that have allowed the Japanese Navy to change the course of the war in China? Well, much as China has lots of river systems, there's also a lot of China that isn't within range of a battleship's guns and, isn't in range and therefore wouldn't be in range of any kind of river system ship sent in. And there is absolutely no way the Japanese Navy is going to bulge up even the Fusos to the extent that you would have to get them up Chinese rivers to fight side-by-side frontline with the Japanese army. Now, if this was occurring maybe in, say, the early 20s, when the Japanese had a bunch of pre-dreadnoughts, and maybe their very, very earliest dreadnoughts that they could try and bulge up as these kind of floating attack vessels, then they might plausibly try, just more for the laughs than anything else, I would think. But even then, as I said, it would help, but it's not going to fundamentally alter the course of a war where 90% of that war is going to be fought well out of the range of those guns. It's not like the Japanese had a huge amount of problem controlling the riverways anyway, without having gigantic riverine battleships. Timely Abyss asks, you once mentioned in a Drydock long ago that Fisher testified that HMS Dreadnought would be capable of defeating 2 or 3 pre-dreadnoughts in combat, and this promised performance was one of the reasons she was built. In order to demonstrate the pace of technology at the time, what ship do you think was the first ship that would have been able to defeat 2 or 3 dreadnoughts in combat? And when do you think that battleships had progressed far enough for this doubling of power to happen again? So I think I'm in agreement with the original questioner, because his question runs on a little bit further. The Queen Elizabeths are probably the point at which you get a battleship that could take on a couple of HMS Dreadnoughts in single combat and win. Now, the reason I say that is that when Dreadnought came in, part of the reason she could defeat multiple pre-dreadnoughts was because of her speed. She was faster than almost any pre-dreadnought, so she could dictate the terms of battle. And, of course, she had a lot more guns, even though they were of approximately the same firepower. So, worst came to worst, she could fight she could fight 2 dreadnoughts on the same broadside with the same firepower that those dreadnoughts had to use on her. Except, of course, as I said, Dreadnought was faster and had more advanced fire control. Now, when it comes to further battleships after Dreadnought, the slight complication is that their gun size tends to increase. The total number of guns doesn't usually tend to, well, actually doesn't flat out increase at the same proportional level that Dreadnought had versus pre-Dreadnoughts, because Dreadnought had an 8-gun broadside and 10 guns total, as opposed to 4-gun broadside, 4 guns total on a pre-Dreadnought. So you would have to find a ship with either 16 or 20 guns to have a similar scale in terms of barrel number over Dreadnought, and neither of those kinds of ships existed. Even Agincourt only had 14 guns. I mean, if the Leons had been built, then maybe we'd be talking, but they weren't, so such is life. At which point you need to look at a combination of the firepower and speed. Now, there's nothing built that carries 12-inch guns that is particularly that much faster than Dreadnought, with the exception of Battlecruisers, and they're still going to have about the same range. Certainly in World War I, they're going to have about the same effective combat range, and either roughly or identical barrel count numbers when it comes to broadside. So, even one of the latest and greatest generation 12-inch gun dreadnoughts, so you'd be talking about maybe Giulio Cesare, or maybe one of the Kaisers and Koenigs, those 2 classes. They could take on a dreadnought. Could they take on 2 at the same time? Probably not. Now, that means you have to go into the 13.5, 14, 15-inch, but still, most of those are the same speed, or they're significantly less well protected, or they don't have that much greater firepower. But when you get to the Queen Elizabeths, they've got good protection, so battleship grade protection. Their firepower is more than enough to completely outgun a dreadnought, quite decisively. Both have 8-gun broadsides, but one's 15-inch, while the other is 12-inch. And the Queen Elizabeth, with its 24 and a bit knots, has just enough of a meaningful speed advantage that it can dictate the engagement. The problem with almost anything else you put up in this situation would be that either it's not got the speed to dictate the engagement, in which case, even if it's one-on-one better, if you've got 2 dreadnoughts, they can close it down and then it's outgunned. Or, in the case of various battlecruisers, they're fast enough to dictate the engagement, but they don't have the firepower or the armour to actually just get in a full-on slugging match. In some ways, you can kind of see the problem when you have Goeben being attacked by various Russian pre-dreadnoughts. Firepower-wise, in terms of barrel numbers, it should win. Speed-wise, it should win. Protection-wise, it's got slightly better armour than some. The problem is that the amount of firepower it can bring to bear is not quite enough because the ranges are similar by that point. Obviously, the Russians have advanced their pre-dreadnoughts. So although it can one-on-one any of the Russian pre-dreadnoughts, collectively the Russian pre-dreadnoughts are able to force it to retreat. Whereas with the Queen Elizabeths, you can stay at whatever range you want with the QE's speed. The 15-inch guns have enough of a range advantage that they can engage beyond, not necessarily beyond Dreadnought's ability to fire back if the 15-inch guns want to hit, but certainly far enough away that Queen Elizabeth's armour will have a meaningful impact on stopping Dreadnought shells, but Dreadnought's armour won't stop Queen Elizabeth's shells, and Queen Elizabeth can stay there. So basically, Queen Elizabeth can finish off one Dreadnought and then move on to the next without much chance of having taken crippling damage from the first one. Now, as far as when that could happen again, i.e. when was a ship launched that could happily take on two Queen Elizabeths and win, the earliest ship I would credit with that capability, to be honest, it's probably going to be one of the treaty-era battleships. But it is a lot harder because Queen Elizabeth's 15-inch guns retain pretty nasty stopping power against most 1930s and 1940s battleships. The range, or at least the effective range, 29,000 yards and less, both ships could potentially engage in quite happily. So again, it would come down partly to speed to dominate the engagement, and partly also just to number of guns and firepower to knock them out. So 28 knots, the fast battleships maybe could do it. King George V, South Dakota, etc., etc. But it would be a push because they would still have to get in range where they could be hurt. The King George V of the treaty-compliant battleships might have the greatest chance because they have the greatest protection. So they can endure one King George V could, in theory, maybe endure a battering long enough to finish off one of the QEs and then move on to the other one. But I think really you have to look to ships like Iowa or Yamato in terms of speed in the first case and sheer firepower and protection in the second, before you can comfortably say that these ships could take on two Queen Elizabeths at the same time and comfortably be confident of coming out ahead, especially given by that point you talk about maybe modernised QEs. Dio Giovanni asks, would you do a video about the Venetian Navy and the Arsenal, or is that too far outside the scope of the channel? No, the Navy of Venice and its arsenal are definitely well within the scope of the channel, and at some point in the future I definitely do want to do a video on them. The thing is, unlike some parts of Italian naval history, there is a fair bit written in English about the Venetian Navy and its arsenal. So, there's plenty to write. However, having been to Venice once as a teenager, I know there's a pretty decent naval museum in Venice, and parts of Venice's naval history in terms of infrastructure, parts of the arsenal, etc., are still physically there. So while it might be one of the more expensive videos to produce, I think if I was going to do a video on the Venetian arsenal and its navy, I probably would want to actually go back there and do filming there, and obviously that would require not just physically getting plane tickets, booking hotels, etc., but I'd also have to arrange things with the museum curators there, and if there was any local historians who knew some specific hidden things that me as a tourist historian might not necessarily find. So it would take a little bit of time to organise, but then the flip side to that is that it can be a lot more comprehensive. Plus, I'd need to find out what the policy on drones is. Josh Thomas Moore asks, why did ships with an odd number of guns leading to them having a single gun in a one turret, such as De Ruyter or Bliskovica, have a single gun in the front? I would have thought it would go astern to maximise the forward firepower. So there's a couple of primary reasons for this. One is that most ships of this period have a quarterdeck break. So on De Ruyter here, you can see that's actually quite far aft. On a lot of ships, it was actually much further forward, usually just aft of the bridge or somewhere like that. And that meant that the aftmost gun, which was at deck level, would be a deck further down, and the superfiring gun would be usually at the level of the frontmost lowest turret, which then meant the uppermost gun turret would be, if it was at the front, would be the single highest, which meant it has the greatest impact on stability, which in turn means that if your ship is constrained enough in its displacement, stability, size, cost, etc., that you need to sacrifice one or two guns off of a turret and just have a single mount, usually it's a twin going down to a single, then the single best place for that to be in terms of saving stability on the ship is going to be the forward superfiring turret, because it's the highest of them all. Now, there are a few exceptions to this. Obviously, there are flush-decked ships, and there's ships like HMS Belfast and Edinburgh, where although they have the quarterdeck step down, they actually have their aft armament raised, so it's at the same level anyway. But those ships, generally speaking, haven't had to make that sacrifice in the first place. There is, however, one other reason, and that is that, again, generally speaking, not necessarily all the time, but generally speaking, if you look at a top-down view and you run surface area and volume calculations, if you treat the forward armament and the aft armament in the case of ships that have grouped forward and aft superfiring turrets, generally the amount of surface area and volume forward of the foremost guns actually works out being slightly less than that's aft of the aftmost guns. And that's almost all entirely thanks to the fact that bows have to be very, very fine, usually. Sterns, usually not so much. And thus, if you're looking at it from a weight perspective, if weight saving is your particular thing, then saving weight over the bow area actually has more effect on the ship's trim than saving weight on the aft area, i.e. if you're right at the margins of your displacement, saving weight at the bow is going to help more than saving weight aft. But that's very marginal, and to be fair, that's less of a rule of thumb than the stability issue, because it depends to a certain degree on the type of ship that you're looking at, because it holds true for most ships, but some ships will have a bit more volume forward than aft relative to the position of their armament in some odd cases. MJ Volda asks, I have the coat of arms from HRMS Cortenar, I think Cortenair? Please forgive me. The modern one, built in 1978. It was sold to the Greeks in the early 2000s, and a family member served on the ship when the ship went out of commission in the Dutch Navy. He took the coat of arms with him, I guess. And I got it from them. So what's up with the crew taking stuff when a ship is decommissioned, and what are the rules? Or is it just like, yep, we're done with this thing, let's take some stuff home as a memory? So broadly, there are technical rules by the book, and there is the practicality of things. So in the more practical sense, what's actually going to happen, regardless of what the necessarily rules by the book say, it comes down to what I would call quality, quantity, and value. So working in reverse order, stuff like, say, a bronze propeller, which, okay, might be a bit difficult for anyone to make off with one of those anyway, unless you have a truck and maybe it's a World War II destroyer or something, but nonetheless, stick with it. Something like a propeller, it's a huge amount of bronze. It's going to be very valuable to whoever is scrapping the ship, so you're probably not going to be allowed to take that away. So that's an example. Quantity, if you are trying to make off with a good chunk of the bow or something like that somehow, again, relatively valuable to the scrappers, also somewhat obvious. So again, you're not going to get away with that. And then quality, so stuff like the ship's entire silver service or the ship's bell, that may have some kind of value to the navy in question. So they may wish to preserve the bell, they may wish to preserve the dinner service, etc., etc. So they'll be keeping an eye out for that and making sure it goes off on their own. And also, in terms of, if you like, quality in dash value, I'm not entirely sure how to express it, but basically you're not going to be able to walk off with like an SM-2 missile or a Sea Dart or a Sea Wolf or, you know, something like that, live main gun ammunition, because, well, it should be fairly obvious why you're not supposed to take stuff like that away. And similarly for, like, you know, classified computer electronic systems these days, or, you know, radar components back then. However, if what you're trying to take isn't so big it's going to be very, very obvious that somebody is obligated to try and stop you, it doesn't have a ridiculously high value in terms of monetary impact, so that, you know, the scrappers or whoever are going to complain that the value of what they've bought has been degraded, and it doesn't have any kind of intrinsic qualitative value to the navy that is scrapping it, then with those caveats, you can, practically speaking, you can take pretty much whatever isn't bolted down, or if it is bolted down and you've got a spanner, you can take that as well. It basically falls into, can you get it off the ship without anyone noticing or without anyone plausibly noticing? Is there plausible deniability over what you're taking? And two, is anyone really going to miss it in the grand scheme of things? So, you know, it could be anything from like a ship's badge, coat of arms badge, if the navy doesn't want to necessarily preserve that particular one in question. It could be, you know, a porthole, or, you know, a picture, a door fitting, you know, various bits and pieces like that. It can even be things like entire chairs and tables and things like that. Now, you might think, well, you can't really stuff a table or a chair or a sofa under your coat. Well, that's true. But you can have a shore party go up and strip out a bunch of stuff because, hey, it's going to the scrappers. They're going to be cutting up for metal. They don't really want to worry about all this upholstery in there catching fire, or whatever. And anyway, it's all going into the store warehouse, and some of it, you know, because then the navy will go, right, if this particular set of seats or this particular set of kitchenware is in good condition, then we can redistribute it to another ship. And if, while it's there, you know, dining table number 57 or, you know, comfy sofa number 24 disappears before full inventory is taken, well, then clearly it was probably one of those that was too broken, rat-eaten, etc. to be bothered to haul off the ship, so nobody cares and things in the breaker anyway. Eric Akorsi asks, are there any books you'd recommend about battle cruisers in general, outside of the ones listed on Amazon? So I would recommend 3 books as a primary reference in terms of, you know, these would be your go-to initial references. They'll probably answer most of the questions you have, and then if you have further questions, you can go to further books or primary documents. That would be British and German Battle Cruisers by Cosentino and Stanglini, which is up there for you to see now. And then specifically for German battle cruisers by Gary Staff, and for British battle cruisers, originally enough, British Battle Cruisers by John Roberts. That's British Battle Cruisers 1905 to 1920, because he has also written a book called Battle Cruisers. So those would be my top 3. Then if you want to go into a little more detail and or, you know, just have other reference books, both Norman Friedman's book on British battleships and R.A. Burt's book on British battleships also cover the battle cruisers. They technically maybe should be called British capital ships, but never mind. And likewise from the German side, there's the Kaiser's Battle Fleet, German capital ships 1871 to 1918 by Aidan Dodson, which again primarily covers battleships, but also covers battle cruisers. So, you know, say, with that range, although the first 3 that I mentioned will probably be my go-tos, they will give you a good overview of most of what you want to know, and there's plenty of stuff in the bibliography to follow up if you want to explore things in more detail. Samoilenko asks, who is effectively better in a straight cruiser versus cruiser combat, the Hipper class or the Deutschland class? For example, if Hipper was at the Battle of the River Plate instead of Graf Spee, could things have gone differently? Well, in the wonderful world of interwar German shipbuilding, every Hipper is different and every Deutschland is different. Albeit the Deutschlands have a little bit more variation in the vital particulars compared to the Hippers, at least in as much as Deutschland has armour broadly comparable to, if not fractionally inferior to Hippers, whereas Graf Spee has armour that is substantially better than the Hippers. Nonetheless, in a cruiser versus cruiser combat situation, if it's 1v1, I would still tend to go for the Deutschlands, simply because that 11-inch Alpha Strike, given that they've got relatively decent gunnery, has the potential to knock down an incoming cruiser and degrade its combat capability quite significantly, quite quickly. Now, the greater number of guns and the theoretically greater rate of fire on the guns of an 8-inch cruiser like Admiral Hipper would probably long-term get the better of the Deutschland, because there's more chances to hit, and even Graf Spee was vulnerable to 8-inch shells at some ranges. So in a longer-term engagement, 1v1, I'd favour the Hippers, but in, say, the first 10-15 minutes, I would favour the Deutschlands. But then again, you know, the Hippers have a lot more displacement on them than the Deutschlands do, so that's not necessarily a huge surprise. But if you're talking about going up against other cruisers, i.e., you know, River Plate scenario where you're going up against multiple cruisers, then at that point, actually, I think, apart from the fact that the Hippers would have the speed to potentially disengage and run away, which the Deutschlands don't, but assuming they're at court for some reason and they have to fight, I think the Deutschlands have a marginally better chance of things, because neither the Hippers nor the Deutschlands have armour substantially strong enough to resist incoming 8-inch shell fire at the closer ranges. And the Hippers overall also have some vulnerability to 6-inch shells. Graf Spee is somewhat, with a sort of roughly an extra inch more belt armour, is somewhat better at resisting 6-inch shells, although if this was Deutschland, aka Lutzow, with thinner armour, then things might be different again. But the other thing is that, you know, the salvo firepower of 3 11-inch guns is enough that Graf Spee at River Plate could, albeit somewhat imperfectly, engage one opponent with one turret and one opponent with the other turret, whereas a Hipper trying to engage one cruiser with 4 8-inch guns and another cruiser with 4 8-inch guns, that is not so much of a particularly brilliant plan. It's just the weight of broadside is just a little bit too small. So, yeah. Against a group of cruisers, not that either Graf Spee or Hipper would be walking away from it, probably the Graf Spee is the slightly better choice, unless you just want to run away, in which case the Hipper is the better choice. But 1v1, a Deutschland is the better choice for the opening sort of 10-15 minutes of the engagement, but as time goes on, the Hipper becomes the better choice. Class A Cornate asks, could a Pre-dreadnought have had its secondary batteries ripped out, torpedo bulges fitted, davits and accommodations mounted, and then serve as a cost-effective amphibious assault ship? I mean, theoretically, sure. A bunch of various older ships were converted to various purposes surrounding amphibious assault, so some of the cruisers had extra bulges fitted to serve as kind of monitors before they could actually build dedicated monitors. The Zeebrugge raid obviously had Vindictive, which was an old cruiser converted into a more direct assault ship. So, I mean, yes, the concept of turning an old Pre-dreadnought into an amphibious assault ship, I think, for, you know, something like Gallipoli, etc., probably has some merit. But I would possibly actually go slightly further. So yes, you want your torpedo bulges, and you want accommodations. I wouldn't, however, necessarily go with davits and the ability to launch large amounts of landing craft. Now, landing craft, as some prototype versions did exist for the Dardanelles, but actually, for a World War I amphibious landing, I would be far more tempted to perhaps go down the route of what's the best way to describe it? I would go down the route of making a direct assault ship in the manner that actually, I think it was either a passenger liner or a cruise ship or a cargo ship, was actually converted at Gallipoli. So if I was told you're taking this pre-dreadnought, we want to turn it into an assault ship. Yes, obviously, put massive bulges in. That's a given. However, rather than ripping out the entire secondary battery, I would perhaps remove some of the aft secondary battery, but I would move it forward in shielded mounts, maybe underneath the bridge or something, firing directly forward. I would remove the entire aft main armament to make the ship lighter and free up space and weight. I would then probably also remove the main guns from the forward main battery, partly to save weight and partly because their rate of fire is quite slow. And using that spare weight, I would up armor the bow of the ship. I would then install some lighter guns, maybe some more of the secondary battery from the aft that I've scavenged, in the gun ports of the forward turret, because that's still quite a well-defended gun house. Obviously, you'd have to play around with ammunition hoists and so forth, but the main battery magazines would be able to carry an awful lot of 6-inch ammunition, for example. And then with this kind of very front firepower heavy accommodation aft, bow armoured, now very shallow draft vessel, I would then follow roughly the same kind of scheme that they followed with the converted assault ship at Gallipoli historically, which is you take this thing and you ram it up onto the shallow beach. In theory, eventually, if you want it back, you can tow it off, or maybe you go in at low tide and float off at some point later on. But the idea would be to create a 15,000 ton fortress from which the men can disembark. So you might need some boats aft, but you'd have ramps and so forth exiting. Not from the upper deck, because they'd be vulnerable to machine gun fire being sweeping from there, but exiting from doors, hatchways, etc., that you would put in the side of the ship, because you're not going to, unfortunately, clamshell the entire front of a pre-dreadnought. And the idea would be that the men would be safe against incoming light artillery and machine gun fire because of the extra armour you've put in the bow, and by moving a good chunk of the ship's secondary battery to face directly forward and or in the main turret, you can now provide suppressing fire against the enemy defences directly from numerous 6-inch guns, probably some of the tertiary armament as well. If you want to, you could put a mortar battery in the barbette pit of the aft, where the aft armament used to be, firing up and over, to provide some more indirect fire support. You can, of course, use the ship's fire control and spotting tower equipment to direct all of this fire, and you can stick a bunch of machine guns there as well. So if you've up-armoured the bow, but you keep, say, the portholes in operation, each of those portholes can now become an armoured firing point for what is now an exceptionally well-defended machine gun point. So you create this nest of firepower, you hose down the enemy nearby, you deploy the men, and then if any longer distance enemies show up, you've still got a huge 6-inch battery of artillery which you can use to take those out as well. So that would be my idea of an amphibious assault pre-dreadnought. Alec Hruby asks, were there any battles between non-aligned navies and Axis or allied navies, and if so, how did they not lead to war being declared? Was this at all common through history? Well, of course, you have Mers el-Kebir, which at the time, technically, France was a non-aligned entity. Vichy France, that is. and that was obviously a battle between the British, part of the Allies, and the France as the non-aligned navy. Copenhagen, certainly the first, was an attack on what was technically a non-aligned territory, which sort of led to a war. Certainly the second attack on Copenhagen did. Mers-el-Kabir, of course, didn't technically lead to a war between the Allies and Vichy France, although it did lead to a rather severe cooling of relations between the two, and pushing Vichy France a bit more towards the Axis. Not that Pétain needed a great deal of help in that regard. So, yeah, these kinds of things did occur. Where they were deliberate, they usually tended to take one of two forms. Usually, either the attack was so overwhelming, i.e. pre-calculated by the attacking side, that it accomplished the objective of knocking the other side out of the war or suppressing them enough that it didn't matter. Or, if it didn't do that, if it either failed or it wasn't well planned enough, or it was more of a just kind of slapping people's hands away style of attack, at least in intent, then it could lead to war, although more specifically it could lead to that attacked party siding more or entirely with the opposite side. But sometimes, I say, it did have this suppressive effect. It wasn't massively common as compared to the number of battles between declared outright hostiles, because, you were taking a calculated gamble of taking your own ships off of the front line against your opponent, then fighting a battle which you may or may not win, but would in any case result in damage, which would reduce your overall fleet strength, on the basis that you might either knock out, suppress, or force to join a smaller non-aligned navy, and the risk, of course, being that you might lose, and or that nation might now side against you, and you've made your situation worse. So usually, where it wasn't an accidental escalation or a case of mistaken identity, such attacks were generally driven either by supreme arrogance or supreme desperation on behalf of the larger nation that was doing the attacking. And, well, I'll leave you to make up your mind as to which of the two was present at some of the incidents we've mentioned. Art Brogden asks, would the cruisers and modern destroyers lost in the evacuation of Crete have made a difference in the defence of Force Z? In other words, did the decision by Churchill to intervene in Greece have horrible strategic implications that echoed into the destruction of ABDA Command? So the Royal Navy lost a total of 7 destroyers, most of which were of the more modern types, in the operations relating to Greece and Crete. And they also lost quite a number of cruisers. So York was lost right at the beginning. You can argue whether that's related directly to the Greek and Cretan campaigns. I'd say probably just about yes. They also lost Bonaventure, which was a Dido class, Gloucester, Town class, Fiji, Crown Colony class, and Calcutta, which was a C class converted to an anti-aircraft cruiser. So that's 5 cruisers on top of the 7 destroyers. Now, would any of those have been assigned to Force Z if they hadn't have been lost? Maybe, maybe not. It's not exactly like the Mediterranean had a surfeit of ships that it could spare. But you've also got to bear in mind that on top of the ones that were lost, there were also quite a number damaged. And that took them out of action for a while. They had to then either be replaced by others or the Mediterranean fleet had to go short. So if you factor in the damaged destroyers, cruisers, battleships, etc., then, and sort of factor those into then instead being operational, maybe some of them would be detached to go and help out Force Z, and maybe that could have made a difference. But it really depends on which ones get detached. Because, with the best will in the world, HMS York, or maybe even Fiji, if they'd been sent, I don't think they would have done that much other than maybe provide the Japanese with another target. Bonaventure, of course, being a Dido class, even if she didn't have the full suite of armament, might have made something of a difference. Given her general AA performance, Gloucester probably could have made a decent difference, and Calcutta, obviously being converted to an AA cruiser, would also have made a decent difference. I think any one of those three might well have made a difference. The destroyers, well, the Japanese did mistake one of the destroyers for one of the battleships while it was on detached duty and expended some munitions on her, so maybe they might attack one or two other destroyers and waste some munitions on them, but I don't think the destroyers themselves would make a huge amount of difference, given that the British destroyers at this time lack a true dual-purpose main armament. Although, that being said, if they had one or two modern destroyers with them, given that the limited elevation did allow the destroyers to engage aircraft that were attacking targets that the destroyers were escorting, like, Repulse and Prince of Wales, maybe it would have made some difference. But I think it's difficult to say whether or not anything would have been spared, or whether or not they just would have stayed with the Mediterranean fleet because they were desperately needed there. But if anything was going to be spared that may or may not have made a difference to Force Z, you probably would be looking at Bonaventure, Gloucester, or Calcutta. 3 or 4 modern destroyers, all firing 4.7-inch guns in AA mode at the torpedo bombers, might have done something. But I think, 1 or 2 of the cruisers will probably have been more useful. So, yes, in theory, potentially the losses taken in the Greece and Crete campaigns might have contributed to Force Z's loss by meaning there were fewer escorts, but at the same point I hesitate to say it's definitive, because it's entirely possible it might not have changed the force escort disposition of Force Z anyway. Adony and Becky asks, over the years there's been a lot of discussion on regular versus small tube boilers and regular versus high pressure boilers. What is the actual difference in size between regular and small tube boilers, and pressure between standard and high pressure boilers? So, period literature suggests that the definition, or the dividing line, if you like, between a small tube and a large tube boiler was considered to be, if the tube was greater than 2 inches in diameter, it was large tube, and if it was 2 inches or less, then it was small tube. And then exactly what diameter the boiler tubes were for any given ship obviously varies hugely by nation and by manufacturer. So, for example, on some French pre-dreadnoughts, some of the later era ones, their boiler tube diameter was 2.75 or 2.8 inches. On other nations' pre-dreadnoughts, the tube diameter was considerably more than that. On some ships that were equipped with small tube boilers, it was exactly 2 inches, and on some ships so equipped, the diameter was slightly less. Now, it might sound like maybe there's not a huge amount in it, if the difference is, maybe about an inch or so. But if you consider, let's say we take a boiler tube diameter of 2.8 inches, so that means the area of that tube is 6.16 inches, thereabouts. And then we reduce it to 1.8 inches, so the area has gone down to just a fraction over 2.5 inches. So in terms of area occupied, and of course it's an imperfect calculation because we're talking about circles here, but just very crudely speaking, you could comfortably get 2 1.8-inch tubes in the overall area occupied by a single 2.8-inch tube, with a bit of room to spare. Obviously not necessarily side by side, but when you are talking about the number of tubes you have in a boiler, like you can see here, it does actually add up. And where this becomes important is because the circumference of that 2.8-inch tube, which is going to obviously be dictating the surface area that's in contact with the water and the hot gases, depending on which side of the pipe you're on, is about 8.8 inches for the 2.8-inch pipe and about 5.6 inches for the 1.8-inch pipe. And that means if you have 2 pipes for the area of 1, then the circumference, which is going to dictate, as I said, the area of pipe in contact with the water, is actually total area in contact from the 2 smaller pipes is going to be significantly greater by a factor of about, in this particular example, a factor of approximately 30 to 40% than the single larger pipe, and that's obviously quite significant, and that's being, over the sheer number of tubes you're talking about, that's actually being quite generous because there's, as I said, area to spare. So you're actually going to have an even higher increase in efficiency with the small tube boilers than this very crude comparison would otherwise suggest. Now, in terms of boiler pressures, again, it depends on the manufacturer and the nation, but broadly speaking, by World War II, bearing in mind that boilers start out at very, very low pressures, but by World War II, a kind of a standard pressure boiler, i.e. something you might find on a British warship or a Japanese one, might run for a battleship at somewhere between 350 and 450 psi. As I said, depending on the ship, depending on who's making the boiler, and depending on the exact time period the ship was built in. Whereas US ships, for example, running on higher pressure boilers, might be running at 550 to 650 psi. Again, depending on exact variables. And of course, those higher end figures would be more approaching what you could potentially push them to. So, as a rule of thumb, you can roughly estimate that a high pressure machinery set, as used in, say, a Fletcher class destroyer, might be running at 40 to 50% greater pressure than a standard pressure unit found in most other ships. Kevin Weber asks, I love this picture, which he has helpfully attached, and we'll show you in a second. It shows Yorktown, that's the Essex class Yorktown, transiting the Panama Canal. Note the deck edge elevator canted up to about 75 degrees. First, is it correct to assume they couldn't do that normally, and that some kind of pins or bolts were removed and maybe some structural support was provided? And secondly, are you aware of any major warships that after design and construction were discovered to not be able to fit through canals, under bridges, or into perhaps shallow harbours for transit as had originally been planned? So with Yorktown's elevator here, I'm not entirely sure, because looking at it, obviously it does look very unnatural, and certainly this is not a normal position for a deck edge elevator to be in. But unfortunately, because that part of the photo, I mean, the photo itself is very slightly out of focus, but that part definitely is more out of focus than some other parts of it. It's not quite possible for me to tell exactly what make and model of deck elevator that is, and to be fair, I'm not exactly a walking encyclopedia of deck elevator details in any case. But therefore, it's not 100% possible for me to tell you whether something was removed to get the deck elevator to do that. As I said, it's definitely not something you want a deck elevator to do, but looking at the deck elevator that was installed on USS Wasp, that particular type of deck edge elevator to be more specific, probably could actually do that without having to make any major changes apart from possibly removing a safety limiter, because Wasp's deck edge elevator actually went out, around and up, so it had to have the ability to have a full range of motion to get the aircraft up onto the flight deck, at which point, in theory, just pulling the lever arms further backwards than normal would actually cause something like this to occur. Now, this particular deck edge elevator is not that type. You can tell that immediately because you can see just on the right of the picture, on the underside of it, there's this kind of triangle sticking out, which isn't present on Wasp's deck edge elevator. But at the same time, when you look at some other deck edge elevators taken off of Essex classes, they are different again. So there's there's pictures of deck edge elevators that have basically an inverted, slightly angled arch bridge style structure going from end to end, whereas this seems to be mostly flat, but it has a kind of 90-degree triangle piece sticking out about 2/3 of the way along its length. So I would say, depending on the type, it's possible that this is actually just an abuse of existing mechanisms but it may also be that they had to do something. There had to be shenanigans involved to get this to happen. Maybe someone who has a bit more in-depth knowledge of the deck-edge elevator details of Essex-class carriers can tell us precisely. As far as major warships that couldn't fit through things they were supposed to fit through, largely navies were pretty good at calculating that, and in fact significant design changes were often made to ships to ensure that they would fit through things that the Navy wanted them to fit through. So, for example, the Bismarcks had a very wide beam relative to other ships, in part, not entirely, but in part, to give them a somewhat shallower draft so they could go down the Kiel Canal. Various of the larger British warships that were designed, like the G3s, or built, like Hood, were built to certain size limitations specifically so they could fit into certain docks. US ships usually had to be built so that they could fit under the Brooklyn Bridge and, of course, through the Panama Canal. And usually, like 99.9% of cases, they got that right. Where you tended to potentially have some issues is where you had ships that were designed by other nations and didn't have a very specific national requirements in mind, and therefore couldn't meet them. So, for example, the famous picture of Richelieu coming into New York Harbor, if you look at her superstructure, you'll notice the top of the forward superstructure is missing because Richelieu was never designed to be able to fit under the Brooklyn Bridge, and so her forward superstructure was taller than that. But when it came in for her refit in World War II, she had to get under the Brooklyn Bridge, so they had to cut a bit of it off. The Queen Elizabeth class carriers these days have a folding section of their upper superstructure so they can get under the Forth Bridge up in the north of the UK. And of course, some of the refitted standards they knew couldn't get through the Panama Canal. So that wasn't a surprise, but it was something they ended up having to build into them. And finally, Rodney McCoy asks, at the time of the Battle of Tsushima, how would the US Navy have fared against the Imperial Japanese Navy? So this can be a bit of a nightmare to calculate, to be perfectly honest, because the Americans have a superiority in battleships. If you count from the Indiana class onwards, I see basically you ignore the first Texas, the Americans have 12 battleships in commission just before the Battle of Tsushima. With that said, 3 of them are Indianas, which have some issues being at sea in the deep ocean, and they also have Iowa BB4, which is decent for what it is, but is, as I've covered before, a little bit small. Now compared to that, the Japanese, at the time of the start of the Russo-Japanese War, only had 6 pre-dreadnoughts, and if we go by the actual, Russo-Japanese War timeline, so by the time of the Battle of Tsushima, they've actually lost 2 of them to mines, which would leave them with only 4. So even if we eliminate the 3 Indianas and the Iowa from the US battle line and say they've been left at home, the US still has a 2-to-1 advantage in battleship numbers. The flip side is that armoured cruisers, which, as we saw at Tsushima itself, did form part of the Japanese battle line, the Japanese have quite a few armoured cruisers, depending on whether you count the Matsushimas as being able to take part in the line or not. They're technically protected cruisers, but they do carry big guns. I personally wouldn't, but if you don't, then the Japanese have around about, again, depending on definitions, around about 8 armoured cruisers, and the US has 2. So if you include the losses to the minefields, then the Japanese would have 12 ships, 12 line of battle vessels. Not all of them battleships, not 2/3 of them armoured cruisers, but they have 12 vessels. The US has 10, unless they bring Iowa and or some of the Indianas to the fight. Now, obviously, those armoured cruisers are not, on average, not as well protected and definitely not as well armed, but it's targets to shoot at and things to shoot back. So although the overall advantage would lie with the US Navy, assuming, when we are obviously artificially assuming they're able to bring everything, nothing's in refit, repair, etc., etc. On average, the US Navy would have an advantage in the actual fleet line of battle, with obviously the caveat of who exactly is fighting who and where, because the closer it gets to Japan, i.e. if the US Navy is going over to the Western Pacific to fight, the Japanese are going to have a much higher proportion of their protected cruisers and destroyers and torpedo boats available and at play, whereas the US might be able to bring some of its very, very small cruiser fleet in, but not that many, and same with destroyers and torpedo boats, very short range, they might not get all that much. So in terms of overall fleet balance, if you're in a kind of line everybody up in a perfect open ocean battlefield where everyone gets to bring as much as they possibly can, the US Navy would have an overall advantage on the larger end of things, but might be at a slight disadvantage at the lower end of things, and if the lower end of things can bring torpedoes into play, that might even it out, but it would generally just about be in favour of the US Navy, whereas if the US Navy was to commit to maybe basing out of the Philippines and going directly to war with Japan in 1905, if we ignore the Russo-Japanese War, then it would I'd give the advantage to Japan at that point. I don't think the US could bring enough of its firepower to bear across the Western Pacific to be confident of a victory. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening. Hope you're all having a good day, and we'll see you again in another video soon, hopefully. Bye.